they said. "Fly out, Grandpa. We want you here for Thanksgiving." So I did. I packed my bags, bought an $800 ticket, and carried gifts for every one of my grandkids. I landed in Detroit with my heart full of hope. I waited, I called, and then I realized I had been set up for the cruelest holiday of my life. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. Thanksgiving morning should have been filled with warmth, laughter, and the smell of turkey roasting in the oven. Instead, I sat alone in Detroit Metropolitan Airport, surrounded by empty chairs and families rushing into each other's arms. My daughter Sarah had begged me to come. She said the kids missed me. She said the holidays were not the same without Grandpa. For the first time since my wife Eleanor passed away, I felt like someone truly wanted me there, and that small spark of belonging was enough for me to believe. I had sacrificed more than I could afford to make that trip. $800 gone, a price that stung in retirement, but one I gladly paid for the promise of family. I imagined the smiles on my grandkids' faces when they saw the gifts tucked in my bag. I imagined Sarah's hug at the airport, maybe even a tear in her eye. That vision carried me across the country, every mile filling me with anticipation. But when my flight landed, reality greeted me instead. Sarah had promised to be there at 11 in the morning. She knew the details. She knew my struggles with airports now, how Eleanor used to guide me through the chaos. She knew I would be tired, stiff, and carrying too much. Yet the minutes dragged into hours. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was still sitting in that cold metal chair, my phone screen lit up with 17 unanswered calls. I watched the last families leave, children squealing as they ran into the arms of parents and grandparents. Laughter echoed through the terminal, but none of it was for me. By the time the holiday crowd thinned, the terminal felt like a ghost town. My heart sank with every vibration of my phone that wasn't her. That was the moment I realized I had been abandoned. My mind replayed her phone call 3 weeks earlier. Sarah's voice had been so convincing. Jake, 16, asking when Grandpa would visit. Emma, 12, drawing pictures of the family gathered at the Thanksgiving table. Even the twins, Marcus and Maya, just 8 years old, excited to show me their school projects. Sarah painted the perfect picture of reunion, of love, of a daughter who wanted her father back. I believed every word. I wanted to believe, because since Eleanor's death, I have felt invisible to my own children. They only called when they needed money, a favor, or a signature. But that invitation, those words, "Fly out, Grandpa, we want you here," felt different. And so I flew across the country, chasing the hope that I mattered. Instead, I walked straight into the harshest truth of my life. The loneliness had been eating at me for 2 years straight. Ever since Eleanor passed away from cancer in that sterile hospital room while I held her hand and promised to take care of our family. Eleanor had been the glue that held us all together, the one who remembered birthdays, organized holidays, made sure everyone stayed connected. After her funeral, the calls from Sarah and Tom became sporadic. Duty calls that lasted maybe 10 minutes and always ended with them having somewhere else to be. I'd moved to Phoenix after retiring from my job as an electrical engineer in Ohio, thinking the warm weather would be good for Eleanor's health, never imagining I'd be spending my golden years alone in a place where I knew nobody. The retirement community was nice enough, but most of my neighbors were dealing with their own health issues or family problems, and making new friends at 72 proved harder than I'd expected. My daily routine had become depressingly predictable. Morning coffee while reading the newspaper, afternoon walk around the complex, evening phone calls that usually went straight to voicemail, and then the long hours of missing Eleanor so intensely it felt like physical pain. I'd tried staying busy with hobbies, volunteering at the local food bank, even taking a computer class to better stay in touch with the grandchildren, but nothing filled the void left by losing the love of my life and feeling increasingly disconnected from the family we'd built together. When Sarah called that October evening, crying about how much the family missed me and needed me there for Thanksgiving, it felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. She told me that Mike, her husband, had specifically asked for me to come, that he wanted to talk about some business opportunities and get my advice on some investments. Tom, my younger son who lived in California with his wife Linda and their 2 teenagers, was apparently flying in too, making it a complete family reunion for the first time since Eleanor's funeral. The way Sarah described it, they'd been planning this for weeks, and I was the crucial missing piece that would make their Thanksgiving complete. I felt needed again, wanted again, like maybe my children had finally realized how precious family time was after losing their mother. I threw myself into preparing for this trip with an energy I hadn't felt in years, spending 2 weeks carefully selecting gifts and planning every detail of my visit. For Jake, my 16-year-old grandson, who was obsessed with gaming, I bought the latest PlayStation console that had just been released, along with 3 of the most popular games. It cost me nearly $400, money I really couldn't afford, but the thought of seeing his face light up made it worthwhile. For Emma, the artistic one who reminded me so much of Eleanor with her creativity and gentle nature, I purchased a complete professional art set with pastels, charcoal, watercolors, and premium paper, hoping to encourage her talent. The twins, Marcus and Maya, were going through a building phase, so I found elaborate Lego sets that we could work on together during my visit. But my most precious gift was for Sarah herself, something I'd been working on since Eleanor's death. I'd taken Eleanor's handwritten recipe cards, including her famous apple pie that had become legendary at family gatherings, and had them professionally printed and beautifully framed, along with photos of Eleanor making her pies over the years. I even included the little notes Eleanor used to write on the cards, like "add extra love" and "remember to let it cool completely before cutting." I thought Sarah would treasure having her mother's recipes preserved so elegantly, and maybe it would help keep Eleanor's memory alive for the grandchildren who were starting to forget the little details about their grandmother. I also spent hours shopping for the perfect travel outfit, wanting to look sharp when I saw my family again, and I made sure to pack Eleanor's favorite cologne because Sarah had once mentioned how much she missed her mother's scent. I arranged for my neighbor Mrs. Patterson to water my plants and collect my mail, prepaid my bills for the month I planned to stay, and even researched activities we could do together as a family during my extended visit. I was so excited about this trip that I couldn't sleep properly for days before leaving, my mind racing with anticipation of hugs from my grandchildren and meaningful conversations with my adult children. The journey to Detroit started going wrong almost immediately, though at the time I attributed everything to normal travel hassles rather than the deliberate sabotage it actually was. My initial flight from Phoenix was delayed by 2 hours due to mechanical issues, which meant I'd miss my connection in Denver and wouldn't arrive in Detroit until well past the original 11 a.m. pickup time Sarah and I had arranged. I called her from Phoenix before boarding to explain the delay, but her phone went straight to voicemail, which struck me as odd, since she'd been so excited about my visit just the day before when we'd confirmed all the details. I left a detailed message explaining my new arrival time and asking her to call me back, but hours passed without any response. During the layover in Denver, I tried calling again and then tried Mike's number and even attempted to reach Tom, thinking maybe Sarah had told him about the pickup duty, but everyone seemed to have vanished. The second flight was turbulent and uncomfortable, filled with Thanksgiving travelers heading home to their families, and I found myself getting increasingly anxious about the lack of communication from my end. When I finally landed at Detroit Metro at 2 in the afternoon, 3 hours later than planned, I expected to find Sarah waiting anxiously in the pickup area, probably worried sick about my delays. Instead, I found absolutely nothing. No familiar faces scanning the crowd for me, no signs with my name, no frantic family members checking their phones. The airport was already thinning out as most Thanksgiving travelers had reached their destinations earlier in the day, and the few remaining passengers were quickly collected by their waiting loved ones. I stood by the baggage claim for nearly an hour, watching reunion after reunion, families embracing with tears of joy, children running to grandparents with squeals of delight, everything I'd imagined my own arrival would be like. My phone showed multiple attempts to call Sarah, Mike, and Tom, but every call went straight to voicemail, and none of my increasingly worried messages were returned. The terrible possibility that something had happened to my family started creeping into my mind, and I found myself imagining car accidents or medical emergencies that would explain why nobody had come to collect me. After 2 hours of waiting in that airport, watching it empty around me like a tide going out, I finally accepted that something was seriously wrong and decided to take a taxi to Sarah's house in Bloomfield Hills, despite the expense I really couldn't afford. The cab ride cost $63 including tip, money that represented a significant chunk of my monthly discretionary budget, but I was too worried about my family's well-being to care about the financial hit. During the 30-minute drive through Detroit's suburbs, I kept calling my children's phones obsessively, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails asking if everyone was okay and explaining that I'd taken a cab to Sarah's house. The taxi driver, a kind, older gentleman named Hassan, who probably recognized the worry in my voice, tried to reassure me that Thanksgiving was a busy day for families and maybe they'd just lost track of time or had some last-minute cooking emergency. I wanted to believe him, desperately wanted there to be some innocent explanation for why my entire family had seemingly disappeared on the day they'd begged me to visit. As we drove through the affluent neighborhoods leading to Sarah's house, I found myself rehearsing the relieved laughter we'd share when I discovered the misunderstanding, maybe a miscommunication about pickup times or a family emergency that had simply prevented anyone from checking their phones. I imagined walking into a house full of cooking smells and warm embraces, everyone apologizing profusely for the mix-up and fussing over me to make up for the confusion. Sarah would probably cry and hug me extra tight. The grandchildren would pile onto their long-awaited grandfather, and we'd all laugh about Grandpa's big adventure getting to Thanksgiving dinner. Hassan helped me carry my bags to Sarah's front porch, and I tipped him generously, despite my financial constraints, because his kindness during that anxious ride had meant more to me than he'd ever know. Standing on that porch with my luggage and bags of carefully chosen gifts, I took a deep breath and prepared to ring the doorbell, ready to finally be welcomed into the family celebration I'd been dreaming about for weeks. But as I reached for the doorbell, I heard something that stopped me cold, the sound of laughter and conversation coming from inside the house, the unmistakable noise of a family gathering in full swing. What I saw through that dining room window will haunt me for the rest of my life. A scene so perfect and complete in its cruelty that it took my breath away and left me standing frozen on the porch, like an unwanted visitor at my own family's celebration. There they all were, my entire family gathered around Sarah's beautiful mahogany dining table, the one Eleanor and I had helped them buy 3 years ago when they'd moved into this house. The table was set with the good china, the kind reserved for special occasions, and laden with a traditional Thanksgiving feast that looked like something from a magazine cover. Sarah sat at one end, wearing the pearl necklace Eleanor had left her, looking radiant and happy as she carved turkey with practiced ease. Mike occupied the head of the table, gesturing animatedly as he told some story that had everyone laughing, clearly playing the role of family patriarch that I'd foolishly thought I still held. My son Tom was there too, all the way from California, just as Sarah had promised, sitting next to his wife Linda, both of them looking relaxed and content in a way I hadn't seen in years. The 4 grandchildren were arranged around the table like a Norman Rockwell painting, Jake showing something on his phone to Emma, while the twins giggled at their father's storytelling. Everyone looked so natural, so comfortable, so completely unaware that their grandfather was standing outside in the cold, forgotten, and abandoned after traveling 2,000 miles to be with them. The warm light from the chandelier Eleanor had helped Sarah pick out cast everything in a golden glow that made the scene look even more perfect, even more deliberately exclusive. They weren't saving a place for me, weren't checking their phones for updates on my arrival, weren't even discussing my absence. They were celebrating Thanksgiving as a complete family unit, and that unit apparently didn't include me anymore. I watched Tom lean over to whisper something to Linda that made her cover her mouth and giggle, watched Sarah serve the twins extra helpings of what looked like stuffing, watched Mike raise his wine glass in what was obviously a toast to something wonderful. The house I'd helped them afford, filled with furniture I'd helped them buy, decorated with family photos that included me, was hosting a celebration that had intentionally excluded me from the very beginning. I know I should have rung that doorbell immediately, should have confronted them right then about leaving me stranded at the airport, but something kept me frozen in place, some instinct that I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before I announced my presence. Maybe it was the lawyer's training Eleanor used to joke I had, always wanting all the facts before making my case, or maybe it was just the shock of seeing my family so happy without me that I couldn't quite process what my eyes were telling me. Either way, I found myself standing in the shadows beside their house, close enough to one of the kitchen windows that I could hear conversations drifting out into the cold November air. That's when I heard Mike's voice, loud and clear, saying words that would forever change how I saw my children. I told you inviting the old man was a mistake. He would have just brought everyone down with his constant talk about your mother. Every conversation turns into some story about Eleanor, and frankly, it's getting depressing. The casual cruelty in his voice was bad enough, but what came next was infinitely worse. Sarah, my daughter, who had called me crying 3 weeks ago, actually laughed at her husband's comment and replied, "I know, but I felt guilty after Linda mentioned that Tom was coming. Thank God his flight got delayed, so we don't have to deal with all his needy behavior today." Her laughter, that light, carefree sound I remembered from her childhood, was like a knife through my chest because it was directed at me, at my grief for her mother, at what she saw as my neediness for wanting to maintain a relationship with my family. But Tom's contribution to this conversation was perhaps the most devastating of all because it revealed that this wasn't just Mike being cruel or Sarah being momentarily thoughtless. This was a family conspiracy. "Dad's been so needy since Mom died," Tom said with the kind of exasperation you'd use to discuss a persistent telemarketer, always calling, wanting to visit, asking about the grandkids. "At least this way he'll think we tried to include him, and maybe he'll back off for a while." The three of them continued discussing me like I was some kind of problem to be managed, rather than a father and grandfather who loved them, and none of the grandchildren, my precious grandchildren I'd traveled so far to see, even asked where Grandpa was or when I might be arriving. Standing outside that window, listening to my children dissect my grief and dismiss my love as neediness, I experienced something I'd never felt before in my 72 years. The complete destruction of my understanding of who my family was and who I was to them. The conversation continued inside, each word adding another layer to my humiliation and heartbreak. Linda chimed in with her own observations about how I'd changed since Eleanor died, becoming too emotional and living in the past, as if mourning my wife of 47 years was some kind of character flaw rather than natural human grief. Mike added that my phone calls had become burdensome and that they'd all agreed I needed to find some friends my own age instead of depending on family for social interaction. Sarah, who had inherited Eleanor's gentle voice but apparently none of her compassion, suggested that maybe after today I'd get the hint and give them some space to process their own grief. The irony was staggering because not one of them seemed to be grieving Eleanor at all. In fact, they seemed relieved to be celebrating without any mention of her, without her recipes, without her traditions, without her widower bringing up uncomfortable reminders of mortality and loss. They'd erased her from their Thanksgiving as completely as they'd erased me, and they were all happier for it. I realized that my flight hadn't been delayed at all, that they'd deliberately given me the wrong pickup time or simply planned from the beginning to leave me stranded. The invitation itself had been fake, a cruel performance designed to make them feel better about excluding me while ensuring I'd be too far away to just show up unexpectedly. They'd calculated that I'd eventually take a cab to the house, discover they weren't there, assume there'd been some emergency, and fly home confused but not suspicious. They hadn't counted on me arriving during their dinner, hadn't expected me to witness their perfect family celebration or overhear their casual cruelty. But there I was, invisible and forgotten, holding expensive gifts for people who saw me as a burden, listening to my own children plan my continued exclusion from their lives. The worst part wasn't even the money I'd wasted on flights and gifts or the humiliation of being abandoned at an airport. It was realizing that Eleanor had been the only thing keeping my children connected to me. And with her gone, they felt free to discard me too. The taxi ride to the Holiday Inn was a blur of streetlights and strip malls, the kind of generic American landscape that looks the same whether you're in Detroit or Phoenix or anywhere else, which seemed fitting since I felt completely displaced from my own life. It was the only hotel I could find with availability on Thanksgiving night, and even then, I had to pay premium holiday rates that would strain my budget for months to come. The desk clerk, a tired-looking woman probably working a holiday shift she didn't want, processed my credit card with professional sympathy when she saw my red-rimmed eyes and shaking hands. The room was standard corporate hospitality. Beige walls, generic artwork, a bedspread that had seen thousands of other disappointed travelers, and a view of the parking lot where other lost souls had landed on this day of supposed family togetherness. I arranged the wrapped gifts on the dresser like a shrine to my own stupidity, each carefully chosen present now a mockery of my misplaced faith in my children's love. Jake's expensive gaming console looked ridiculous in its colorful wrapping, a $400 reminder that I'd thought material generosity could somehow purchase genuine affection from a grandson who apparently never asked about me. Emma's art supplies, chosen with such care and hope, now seemed like evidence of my desperate need to believe that my artistic granddaughter might want to share her creativity with a grandfather she'd rather not see. The twins' building sets, meant to create memories of collaborative construction projects, instead highlighted how I'd been building fantasy relationships with children who saw me as an obligation rather than a beloved family member. And Eleanor's framed recipes, my most precious and personal gift, now looked pathetic rather than touching, physical proof that I'd been trying to keep my dead wife's memory alive for people who preferred to forget she'd ever existed. For the first 2 hours in that sterile hotel room, I cried harder than I had since sitting beside Eleanor's hospital bed during her final moments. I wept for the wife who would have been appalled by our children's behavior, for the grandchildren who'd been taught to see their grandfather as a burden, for the family dinners that would never happen, for the loneliness that stretched ahead of me like an endless desert, and for my own foolishness in believing that blood relationships guaranteed love and loyalty. But somewhere around 10 o'clock that Thanksgiving night, as I sat surrounded by tissue boxes and the wreckage of my family fantasy, something fundamental shifted inside me, like a switch being flipped from grief to cold, calculating anger. I stopped crying and started thinking, really thinking, about patterns I'd been too naive or too loving to recognize before this devastating revelation. The tears dried up, replaced by a crystalline clarity that felt almost supernatural in its intensity, as if losing my last illusions about my children had somehow freed my mind to see things as they truly were, rather than as I desperately wanted them to be. I began mentally cataloging every interaction with Sarah and Tom since Eleanor's funeral, looking for the signs I'd missed or willfully ignored because acknowledging them would have been too painful. The phone calls that were always brief and ended with them having somewhere else to be weren't signs of busy lives. They were exit strategies from conversations they didn't want to have. The declined invitations to visit them weren't due to scheduling conflicts. They were polite rejections of my company. The times they'd change subjects when I mentioned Eleanor weren't attempts to spare their own grief. They were efforts to avoid hearing about mine. Even more telling were the occasions when they did call me, which I'd cherished as signs that they still cared but now realized followed a very predictable pattern. They only reached out when they needed something, usually financial help that they framed as temporary loans or emergency assistance. I started remembering conversations where they'd praised my generosity, called me their rock, told me how grateful they were to have such a supportive father, and I'd felt so proud and needed and important. But now I could see those compliments for what they really were: manipulation designed to keep the money flowing from their grieving, lonely father, who was desperate to feel useful to his family. They'd been managing me like a resource, calculating exactly how much attention and false affection they needed to provide to maintain access to my bank account. The realization was so clear and complete that I wondered how I'd ever missed it, except that loving parents want to believe their children are good people, even when mounting evidence suggests otherwise. I spent the next several hours going through my financial records on my phone and laptop, documenting every dollar I'd given my children since Eleanor's death, and the totals were staggering enough to make me physically nauseous. Over the past 2 years, I'd provided Sarah and Mike with $45,000 for what they described as temporary mortgage troubles. After Mike's consulting business hit a rough patch, they'd promised to pay it back within 6 months, but that deadline had passed over a year ago, and whenever I gently mentioned repayment, Sarah would get emotional and talk about how stressed they were about money, how much they appreciated my help, and how they'd start paying me back as soon as Mike's business recovered. Tom had been even more expensive, requiring $30,000 for what he'd called a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to open a small restaurant in San Diego with his business partner. He'd shown me projected profit margins, talked about how the restaurant would provide financial security for his family, and promised that I'd be the first investor repaid once they became profitable. That conversation had taken place 18 months ago, and when I'd asked about the restaurant recently, Tom had claimed it had failed due to the economy and apologized for not being able to repay my investment. But the financial support hadn't stopped there. Over the past 2 years, I'd also covered Emma's emergency dental work when she'd needed braces, paid for Jake's private tutoring when he'd been struggling in school, helped with car repairs when Linda's minivan broke down, covered medical bills when Tom's family had been between insurance policies, and even paid deposits for family vacations that they'd claimed were necessary for their mental health after losing Eleanor. Every time, the requests had come with emotional appeals about family sticking together, about how Eleanor would have wanted me to help, about how grateful they were to have such a generous father. I'd felt so good about being able to provide for my family, so proud that my years of hard work and careful saving could make their lives easier. Now I realized that my generosity had been nothing more than an ATM to them, and my desire to honor Eleanor's memory by taking care of our family had made me an easy mark for their financial manipulation. Rather than flying home the next day as originally planned, nursing my wounds and accepting my role as the family outcast, I made a decision that surprised even me. I extended my hotel stay for a full week and began treating this situation like the complex problem it was, one that required investigation, documentation, and strategic planning rather than emotional reaction. I called the airline and changed my return flight, paying the change fees without hesitation because I knew this investment in time and money would be crucial for what I was planning. This wasn't about revenge in any petty sense. This was about justice, accountability, and protecting myself from further exploitation by people who'd proven they saw me as nothing more than a source of funding. I spent Friday morning researching private investigators in the Detroit area, looking for someone with experience in financial fraud and family disputes who could help me gather the evidence I'd need to pursue legal remedies. The investigation firm I selected, Midwest Investigative Services, came highly recommended by online reviews and had a female lead investigator named Janet Morrison, who specialized in cases involving family financial abuse of elderly relatives. When I called their office, Janet herself answered the phone, and after hearing a brief summary of my situation, she agreed to meet with me that afternoon at my hotel. Janet turned out to be a woman in her 50s with a professional demeanor that managed to be both compassionate and businesslike. Exactly what I needed in my emotionally fragile state. She'd handled dozens of cases similar to mine, situations where adult children systematically defrauded their aging parents through emotional manipulation and false financial emergencies. Janet explained that elder financial abuse was far more common than most people realized, and that the perpetrators were usually family members who exploited their parents' love, trust, and desire to leave a legacy for their children. She outlined exactly what kind of evidence would be needed to pursue legal action: documentation of all financial transactions, proof of false representations about how the money would be used, evidence that the loans were never intended to be repaid, and ideally, communications that showed the children's real attitudes toward their father. Janet's professional validation that my situation wasn't just a family misunderstanding, but actual financial fraud helped me feel less like an overly sensitive old man and more like a victim who deserved justice. Janet's preliminary investigation, completed within just 3 days of intensive work, revealed a level of deception that exceeded even my worst fears about my children's behavior and fundamentally changed how I understood the past 2 years of my life. The $45,000 I'd given Sarah and Mike for mortgage troubles had never gone toward their house payments at all. Janet's financial analysis showed that they'd used the money to completely renovate their kitchen with high-end appliances and granite countertops, and they'd also purchased a 25-foot boat that they kept at a marina outside Detroit. Bank records obtained through legal channels showed that their mortgage had never been in jeopardy. Mike's consulting business was actually doing quite well, and they'd simply wanted to upgrade their lifestyle without taking out additional loans or dipping into their own savings. Even worse, Janet had discovered text message exchanges between Sarah and her friends where she'd bragged about the easy money from Dad and joked about how gullible I was about their fake financial problems. Tom's situation was even more infuriating because his restaurant hadn't failed at all. Janet's investigation revealed that the restaurant had been moderately successful for about 8 months before Tom and his business partner sold it to a larger restaurant group for a substantial profit. Tom had pocketed his share of the sale proceeds, around $60,000, without ever mentioning to me that the business had been sold rather than failed. He'd continued letting me believe that my $30,000 investment had been lost to economic conditions, even going so far as to send me fake sympathy cards on the anniversary of the restaurant's supposed closure. Janet had also uncovered evidence that both of my children had been discussing my finances with each other, coordinating their requests for money to avoid asking for too much at once, and sharing strategies for emotional manipulation that would be most effective given my grief state. They'd apparently developed a system where they'd take turns approaching me for financial help, spacing out their requests strategically and comparing notes on which approaches worked best for extracting maximum amounts with minimum suspicion. The most damning evidence was a group text conversation between Sarah, Tom, and their spouses, where they'd calculated my approximate net worth based on Eleanor's life insurance payout and my retirement accounts, and had actually divided up projected inheritance amounts, treating my death as a financial planning opportunity rather than a family tragedy they hoped to delay as long as possible. Armed with Janet's comprehensive investigative report, I scheduled a consultation with David Richardson, an estate and elder law attorney whose reputation for handling family financial disputes was sterling, according to multiple referrals from Janet's professional network. David's office occupied the top floor of a downtown Detroit high-rise, all mahogany and leather and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city where my children lived, their comfortable lives funded by my retirement savings. David himself was a distinguished man in his early 60s with the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of helping families navigate their most painful conflicts, and he reviewed Janet's findings with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen similar betrayals countless times before. After 2 hours of going through every document, every bank record, every text message, and every false claim my children had made, David's assessment was both devastating and empowering. I had multiple legal options for recovering my money and preventing future exploitation, ranging from civil lawsuits for fraud and elder abuse to criminal referrals if I chose to pursue that route. More importantly, David revealed something that would become the cornerstone of my strategy for justice. Eleanor had been far more financially sophisticated than any of us had realized, and her estate planning had included provisions that my children knew nothing about. During our marriage, Eleanor had quietly established a trust fund worth over $500,000, money she'd accumulated through careful investing of inheritance from her parents, proceeds from some real estate investments she'd made independently, and funds from a life insurance policy on her own life that had been separate from our joint financial planning. As the surviving spouse, I was the sole trustee of this fund with complete discretion over distribution to our children, and Eleanor's instructions had been very specific. The money was intended for true emergencies or genuine need, not lifestyle enhancements or business ventures, and it could only be distributed if I determined that the recipients had shown proper gratitude and respect for the family legacy. Eleanor had kept this trust secret from Sarah and Tom because she'd wanted them to build their own financial independence rather than depending on inheritance, and she'd trusted me to use the fund wisely if circumstances warranted. David explained that this trust was completely legal, properly documented, and absolutely protected from any challenges my children might mount, giving me leverage they didn't even know existed. The existence of Eleanor's secret trust fund changed everything about my strategic position and transforming me from a vulnerable elderly victim into someone who controlled a significant financial resource that my children desperately wanted but had no legal right to expect. David walked me through the trust documents Eleanor had executed 3 years before her death, during a period when she'd been concerned about our children's increasing requests for financial help and worried about what would happen to me if I became too generous with our retirement savings. The trust was brilliantly structured, requiring unanimous agreement between Eleanor and me during her lifetime for any distributions, and giving me sole discretion after her death, based on very specific criteria she'd outlined. Recipients had to demonstrate genuine financial need rather than want, show appropriate gratitude and respect for family relationships, and prove that they were using family resources responsibly rather than frivolously. Eleanor's written instructions, which would be legally binding in any distribution decisions, explicitly stated that the money was meant to provide security and opportunity for our children, not to subsidize lifestyle choices they couldn't afford independently, or to fund business ventures that should be financed through proper commercial channels. She'd also included a clause requiring that any previous family loans be repaid before trust distributions could be made, specifically noting her concern that our children seemed to view parental financial help as gifts rather than loans that carried moral and legal obligations for repayment. Most significantly, Eleanor had anticipated exactly the situation I now found myself in, writing that if our children ever showed disrespect, ingratitude, or exploitation toward their surviving parent, the trust funds should be redirected to charitable causes that would honor our family values rather than reward bad behavior. Reading Eleanor's precise, thoughtful language felt like receiving guidance from beyond the grave, as if she'd known that our children's character flaws would eventually require exactly this kind of intervention. David explained that the trust gave me enormous leverage in any negotiations with Sarah and Tom because they'd been counting on substantial inheritance to fund their future financial plans, and discovering that their behavior had cost them access to $500,000 would be a devastating shock that might actually motivate genuine remorse and behavior change. I decided that rather than confronting my children individually or handling this through lawyers exclusively, the situation called for a family meeting that would allow me to address everyone simultaneously and ensure that there could be no misunderstandings, no private negotiations, and no opportunities for them to coordinate their responses or manipulate the narrative. I called Sarah on Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after the Thanksgiving disaster, using the calm, measured tone I'd perfected during my engineering career when delivering bad news to clients or supervisors. I told her that I had important information to share about Eleanor's estate and my own financial planning, and that I needed everyone present for a formal family meeting that weekend. Sarah's immediate enthusiasm was almost comical, because she obviously assumed this meeting would involve distributing inheritance, money, possibly even Eleanor's life insurance proceeds that she'd been asking about for months. When she asked if she should arrange for the grandchildren to be present, I told her this was an adults-only discussion about financial and legal matters, which seemed to excite her even more because she interpreted it as confirmation that serious money was involved. I repeated the same process with Tom, using identical language about estate matters and financial planning, and his reaction was similarly greedy and presumptuous, immediately asking if he should book an earlier flight from California to make sure he didn't miss anything important. Neither of them expressed any concern about my well-being after the Thanksgiving incident, any curiosity about why I'd never shown up at Sarah's house, or any awareness that they'd done anything wrong by abandoning me at the airport. Their focus was entirely on the potential financial benefits of this family meeting, which told me everything I needed to know about their priorities and their view of our relationships. I reserved the conference room at David Richardson's law office for Saturday afternoon, a neutral location that would underscore the serious legal nature of what we'd be discussing. The conference room was impressive without being intimidating, with a long mahogany table, comfortable leather chairs, and windows overlooking downtown Detroit that created an atmosphere of professional gravity appropriate for the reckoning I had planned. David would be present as my legal counsel, along with Janet Morrison, to present the investigative findings, creating a formal structure that would prevent my children from turning the meeting into an emotional manipulation session or attempting to gaslight me about facts that had been thoroughly documented through professional investigation. Saturday afternoon arrived with a kind of crisp December weather that made everything seem sharp and clear, and perfectly matching my mental state as I prepared to confront my children with the evidence of their betrayal and the consequences of their actions. Sarah and Mike arrived first, both dressed more formally than usual and carrying themselves with the kind of nervous excitement people show when they're expecting good news about money. Tom and Linda flew in from California that morning, and all four of them entered David's conference room with expressions of anticipation mixed with curiosity about why this meeting required legal representation. I'd arranged for them to be seated on one side of the conference table while David, Janet, and I occupied the other side, creating a visual representation of the adversarial nature of what was about to unfold. After brief introductions that I kept deliberately cold and professional, I began by placing printed documentation in front of each of them, comprehensive financial records showing every dollar I'd given them over the past 2 years, organized chronologically with dates, amounts, and their stated reasons for needing the money. Sarah's face went from eager anticipation to confusion as she recognized bank transfer records and loan agreements she'd probably forgotten signing. Mike started flipping through pages with growing unease, while Tom and Linda exchanged worried glances as they realized this wasn't the inheritance windfall they'd expected. I let them absorb the financial documentation for several minutes before speaking, watching their expressions change from greed to concern to dawning fear, as they began to understand that this meeting wasn't about giving them more money. Then I activated the digital recorder David had prepared and said words I'd been rehearsing for days. "We're here today to discuss the $75,000 you've stolen from me through fraud, and to address your complete betrayal of family trust, including your deliberate abandonment of me at Detroit Airport on Thanksgiving Day." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Sarah's sharp intake of breath and the sound of Tom's papers rustling as his hands began to shake. I continued with clinical precision. "Janet Morrison, the private investigator to my left, will now present evidence of your lies about how my money was used, your coordination of fraudulent requests, and your private communications about manipulating my grief for financial gain." Janet opened her presentation materials with professional calm, and I watched my children's faces cycle through denial, shock, anger, and fear as the full scope of their exposure became clear. This was the moment I'd been planning for weeks, the reckoning that would either restore some dignity to my position as their father or confirm that my family was truly beyond redemption. Janet's presentation was methodical and devastating, each piece of evidence building an undeniable case that transformed my children's shocked denials into desperate attempts at justification and damage control. She began with bank records showing exactly how my $45,000 mortgage assistance to Sarah and Mike had been spent. $28,000 for kitchen renovations that included luxury appliances and imported granite counters, $12,000 for a boat purchase, and the remainder for vacation expenses and designer furniture. When Sarah tried to interrupt with claims that they'd eventually use some of their own money for mortgage payments, Janet calmly produced the mortgage company records showing that their home loan had never been in arrears, never been threatened with foreclosure, and had actually been refinanced at a lower rate just 2 months before they'd claimed to be in financial crisis. Mike's face went white as Janet displayed photographs of their kitchen renovation and boat registration documents, proof that they'd used their desperate financial situation to fund lifestyle upgrades they'd wanted but couldn't justify spending their own money on. Tom's reaction was even more dramatic when Janet revealed that his failed restaurant had actually been sold for a $60,000 profit that he'd kept secret while continuing to accept my sympathy for his business losses. The documentation included the restaurant sale agreement, tax records showing his capital gains, and even social media posts where he'd celebrated the successful sale with friends, all while letting me believe my $30,000 investment had been lost to economic hardship. But the most damaging evidence was the collection of text messages and private communications Janet had legally obtained, conversations that revealed the calculated nature of their financial manipulation. Sarah had texted her sister-in-law Linda saying, "Dad's so easy to get money from since Mom died. He just wants to feel needed," while Tom had responded to one of my concerned phone calls by immediately texting Mike to say, "The old man's getting suspicious." We need to space out our requests more. The group conversation where they divided up my projected inheritance was particularly brutal, with detailed discussions of my life expectancy, speculation about my total assets, and callous jokes about my pathetic attempts to stay connected to grandchildren who'd been coached to see me as a burden. When Tom tried to claim these messages were taken out of context, Janet produced additional communications showing months of coordinated planning, including discussions of which emotional triggers worked best for extracting money and agreements to corroborate each other's false stories about financial emergencies. The final phase of my confrontation began when David Richardson took over the presentation, his authoritative legal voice cutting through my children's increasingly desperate attempts to minimize, justify, or deflect responsibility for their systematic fraud and emotional abuse. David announced that he'd prepared formal demand letters requiring immediate repayment of all fraudulent loans with interest calculated from the dates of the original transfers, totaling just over $90,000, including legal fees and investigative costs, and that these letters would be filed with the court within 48 hours if payment arrangements weren't made immediately. Sarah burst into tears. Not tears of remorse for betraying her father, but tears of panic about the financial consequences of being held accountable for her actions. Mike tried to negotiate, suggesting payment plans and attempting to claim that some of the money had been gifts rather than loans, until David produced the signed loan agreements that clearly specified repayment terms they'd simply ignored. Tom's response was more aggressive, accusing me of entrapment and threatening to hire his own attorney to contest the demands, which gave David the perfect opening to deliver the most devastating revelation of all. David explained that Eleanor had established a trust fund worth over $500,000, money that our children had been counting on as their inheritance, and that Eleanor's written instructions gave me sole discretion over distribution based on very specific criteria, including respect, gratitude, and responsible use of family resources. The trust documents explicitly stated that beneficiaries who defrauded or mistreated the surviving parent would forfeit their inheritance rights, with the funds redirected to charitable organizations that better reflected our family values. I watched the color drain from Tom's face as he realized that his threats of legal action would only strengthen my position, and that his aggressive response was costing him access to a substantial inheritance he'd been planning to use for his own financial security. Linda started crying when the full financial implications became clear, while Sarah looked between her husband and her brother as if searching for someone to blame for the catastrophic situation their greed had created. David continued with professional calm, explaining that the trust provisions were ironclad, that Eleanor had specifically anticipated this type of family conflict, and that their only option for accessing any inheritance was to make immediate restitution for their fraudulent behavior and demonstrate genuine remorse through actions rather than words. I finally stood up and delivered the words I'd been planning for weeks, words that felt like lifting a tremendous weight off my shoulders. You taught me that family means nothing to you, that I'm just a resource to be exploited until I'm no longer useful. You abandoned me at an airport on Thanksgiving Day because my grief over your mother's death was inconvenient for your celebration. You've stolen my money, mocked my loneliness, and treated me like a fool you could manipulate indefinitely. I've learned that lesson well, and I'm applying it to every decision I make from now on. 6 months later, I'm sitting on the balcony of my beautiful apartment in a luxury senior living community in Naples, Florida, watching the sunset paint the Gulf of Mexico in shades of gold and pink that Eleanor would have loved, finally at peace with the family I've chosen to replace the one that chose to discard me. The transition from Phoenix to Florida was surprisingly easy, facilitated by the restitution money my children were forced to pay and the freedom that came from finally accepting that love cannot be purchased, demanded, or expected based on blood relationships alone. Sarah and Tom did eventually repay the money they'd stolen, though it took threats of criminal prosecution and asset seizure to motivate their compliance, and their payments came with lawyer letters rather than personal apologies, confirming that they felt victimized by consequences rather than remorseful about their actions. The inheritance they'd been counting on, Eleanor's carefully preserved trust fund, was donated in its entirety to a scholarship foundation that provides educational opportunities for students who've lost parents, ensuring that Eleanor's legacy supports people who understand the value of family bonds rather than those who exploit them. My new community is filled with people who actually enjoy my company, who invite me to dinner parties and card games and book clubs, and who remember details about my life and ask follow-up questions about things I've shared with them previously. My neighbor Margaret, a widow who lost her husband around the same time I lost Eleanor, has become a dear friend who shares my love of crossword puzzles and old movies, and who never makes me feel like my memories of Eleanor are burdensome or excessive. The activities director, James, always saves me a seat at community events and has helped me discover a talent for watercolor painting that I never knew I had during my working years. These relationships feel natural and reciprocal, based on genuine mutual interest rather than obligation or financial dependence, and I finally understand what Eleanor meant when she used to say that family isn't always about blood, but about people who choose to love and support each other consistently. Sarah and Tom still call occasionally, usually around holidays or when they're facing financial pressures, but I let those calls go to voicemail and delete the messages without listening, having learned that their contact brings nothing positive to my life. The grandchildren I once loved so desperately are essentially strangers to me now, young people who were taught that their grandfather was a nuisance rather than a treasure, and while that loss still causes moments of sadness, I no longer waste emotional energy grieving relationships that were never real in the first place. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.